All right, let's kick off this deep dive into good economics for hard times. And I know, economics, not exactly the most thrilling topic, right? But
Okay.
stick with us because this book, well, it's got some seriously thought-provoking stuff, and it might even change the way you see the world.
I agree. It's definitely not your typical economics book.
Definitely not. So it's written by these Nobel Prize winners, Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo,
Hmm.
and they tackle all these, complex global issues like migration and trade, climate change, inequality, you name it. The thing is, they don't just rehash the same old economic theories. They actually bring in like the latest research and present some really eye-opening truths. And to help us navigate all this, we've got an expert in economics here with us today, and they're going to be like our guide, connecting the dots between all these findings and explaining why it all matters to you, the listener.
Well, I'll certainly try my best to shed some light on all of this.
So one thing that really jumped out at me right off the bat was how the authors addressed this, well, this kind of elephant in the room, which is the public's lack of trust in economists.
Hmm.
Did you know, like, in a recent UK poll, they ranked just above politicians in terms of trustworthiness?
Oh, I remember that poll. Pretty dismal, huh? It's this
Mm-hmm.
weird paradox, right? You'd think with all their data and fancy models, economists would be seen as these reliable sources of information. But it seems people feel like they're out of touch with everyday concerns, too focused on theories and numbers.
It's like they live in this ivory tower or something.
Right.
And that's precisely where Banerjee and Duflo come in. Like they totally flip the script. They acknowledge that economics can't ignore the very human desire for like dignity and connection.
Hmm.
They argue that people aren't just driven by pure logic or self-interest when making economic decisions. Emotions, aspirations, social norms, all that stuff plays a huge role.
Mm,
It's kind of refreshing, actually, to see this more human side of economics.
definitely. It's a welcome change.
So speaking of human desires and aspirations, let's talk about migration. It's one of those topics that always seems to be surrounded by anxieties, especially in places like Europe and the US.
Oh, absolutely.
But is all that fear really justified? I mean, is there truly a mass migration crisis happening?
Well, when you look at the actual data, the picture is a bit different. Despite all the hype, the global percentage of international migrants has remained relatively stable for decades, hovering around 3%. And those peak migration flows that make headlines, they represent a tiny fraction of the host country's population.
Right. The book mentions something like the EU receives between 1.5 and 2.5 million non-EU migrants each year, which is less than 0.5% of their total population.
Exactly. So the idea of Europe being overwhelmed by migrants is, well, not really supported by the numbers.
And here's the thing that I found even more surprising. The research suggests that an influx of low-skilled immigrants doesn't necessarily translate into lower wages or fewer jobs for native workers. They brought up that fascinating Marielitos study from Miami where, like, a huge wave of Cuban immigrants arrived, and guess what? No negative impact on native workers.
It's remarkable, isn't it? And there's a similar study from Denmark where they looked at refugees coming into different cities, and again, no adverse effects on native workers' wages or employment.
It seems counterintuitive, though, right? More people competing for jobs should mean fewer jobs available, shouldn't it?
Well, the authors explain this through what they call the demand channel. It means that when immigrants come in, they also spend money in the local economy, boosting demand for goods and services, which can actually lead to job creation for natives.
Ah, so it's not just about competition, it's also about stimulating the economy.
Exactly.
But there's a catch, right? Like, if immigrants don't spend their earnings locally, then the positive effects might not materialize.
That's right. They mention this example of Czech workers in Germany who commuted back to the Czech Republic every day, so their wages weren't being spent in Germany, which had a negative impact on the German economy.
So it's this complex interplay of factors, and you can't just assume that more people will automatically lead to a worse economy.
Absolutely. It really highlights how interconnected economic systems are.
Which kind of leads to a question that's been bugging me. If people are, in theory, free to move to places with better economic opportunities, why don't they do it more often?
Well, it's not as simple as just packing your bags and going, right.
Right.
Economies have this thing called stickiness. It means there are all sorts of factors that make people reluctant to move, even when it makes economic sense.
Like what?
Well, things like labor laws, social networks, fear of the unknown, risk aversion. People are often attached to their communities, their families, their way of life. Moving can be scary.
Oh, totally. The book had some great examples of this, like this story about that volcanic eruption in the Westman Islands, which forced all these young people to relocate.
I remember that one.
And in the long run, it actually turned out to be beneficial for them. Like they ended up with better jobs and higher incomes. Who knew a natural disaster could have a silver lining?
It's amazing how sometimes these unexpected events can shake things up and lead to positive outcomes.
And then there's the example of job searching in Ethiopia, where apparently it's nearly impossible to get a job without connections. So if you're a newcomer, you're basically stuck.
It's a classic catch-22. You need a job to build a network, but you need a network to get a job.
Mm, so frustrating. It really highlights how important social capital is in economic decision making.
Hmm.
It's not always about rational choices, it's about where you fit in. And it goes beyond jobs, too. Our social networks and the communities we live in, they shape our economic decisions in all sorts of
They
ways,
do.
sometimes leading us to conform to certain norms or even becoming trapped in these echo chambers where everyone thinks the same way.
It's like this herd behavior, right? People see what others are doing and they just follow along, even if it's not necessarily in their best interest. Abhijit Banerjee did some fascinating research on this, looking at trends and how they spread.
Yeah, it's like that whole keeping up with the Joneses phenomenon.
Exactly.
And then there's homophily, which is this tendency for people to stick with those who are similar to themselves.
Birds of a feather flock together.
Precisely. And we see this playing out in, schools, neighborhoods, even in politics. It's like we're constantly seeking out validation for our own beliefs and avoiding those who might challenge our views.
And social media, with its algorithms and personalized feeds, it just amplifies all of this, doesn't it? There was that study on Twitter during the 2012 US election. They found that people were mainly interacting with those who shared their political views, even though they had connections to people from all sorts of backgrounds.
So it's like these digital echo chambers, reinforcing our existing biases and making it even harder to break free.
It's a real challenge to have those productive, nuanced conversations when we're all stuck in our own little bubbles.
And that has huge implications for tackling those big global challenges we talked about earlier, like climate change.
Right, you need collaboration, understanding, a willingness to listen to different perspectives.
But if we're all just talking to people who agree with us, how can we ever find common ground?
It's a good question, and it's something we need to be actively thinking about.
Hmm.
How do we break out of these echo chambers and engage in those difficult conversations?
Maybe that's a topic for another deep dive.
Definitely. There's a lot to unpack there.
So let's shift gears a bit and talk about this whole issue of economic growth. It seems like growth rates are declining in many developed countries. Are we headed for a period of stagnation?
Well, it's a complex issue. Economists often talk about total factor productivity, or TFP. It basically measures how efficiently we're using our resources to produce output. And it's true that TFP growth has been slowing down, which suggests we might be running out of those easy gains from past innovations.
So like the low-hanging fruit has already been picked.
Sort of.
And then there's the whole question of whether GDP is even the right measure of well-being in the first place.
Right. The book challenges that obsession with GDP as the be-all and end-all of economic progress. They argue that it misses a lot of important stuff.
Like they use this example of a rickshaw puller who chooses to spend an afternoon with his family instead of working. That decision lowers GDP, but arguably improves his overall well-being.
It's about recognizing that there are things that matter beyond just material wealth. Things like leisure time, strong social connections, a healthy environment, these are all valuable, even if they don't have a price tag attached to them.
Exactly. And speaking of things we often take for granted, let's talk about the internet. I mean, it's revolutionized our lives in so many ways, but has it really made us more productive?
It's funny you should mention that. The book actually points out that even the World Bank admits the jury's still out on whether the internet has had a truly transformative impact on productivity. Sure, it's made certain things faster and easier, but it's also brought a ton of distractions.
Like how many hours have we all wasted scrolling through social media?
Too many to count, I'm sure.
And here's a finding that I found particularly mind-blowing. Studies have shown that people are actually happier when they use Facebook less.
I've seen those studies too.
Seems counterintuitive, right?
It does, but it makes you think about the impact of all this technology on our mental well-being. Maybe sometimes disconnecting is actually the key to a more fulfilling life.
So it's not just about being more productive. It's about figuring out how to use technology in a way that enhances our lives, not detracts from them.
Absolutely. It's about finding that balance.
All right, so we've talked about migration, growth, and even the internet. But what about the role of government in all of this? I mean, there's so much skepticism about government intervention these days. Can we really afford to just leave everything to the markets?
It's a tough question. There's a lot of debate about how much government should intervene in the economy. Some people argue for a very hands-off approach, believing that markets are the best way to allocate resources and drive innovation.
Like the whole invisible hand idea.
Exactly. But others argue that government has a crucial role to play in providing public goods, regulating industries, protecting vulnerable populations, and ensuring a more equitable distribution of wealth.
So it's like finding that sweet spot between too much government and not enough.
Right. And the authors make a compelling case for a more nuanced view of government intervention. They acknowledge that there are legitimate concerns about government overreach and inefficiency.
Like we've all seen examples of government programs gone wrong, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. But they also emphasize that markets aren't perfect either. There are situations where market forces alone can't solve problems, or where they actually create new problems.
Like the book talks about corruption in pollution control, where companies basically pay bribes to avoid complying with environmental regulations.
Right. And then there's the whole college admissions scandal, which showed how wealthy parents were willing to cheat the system to give their kids an unfair advantage.
So it's not just about government versus markets, it's about understanding the limitations of both and finding ways to make them work better together.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
And it all comes back to that human element, right? People aren't always rational actors. They make mistakes, they're influenced by their emotions, their biases, their social networks.
That's where behavioral economics comes in.
Right.
It's this fascinating field that looks at how psychological factors influence economic decision-making.
And that has huge implications for how we design policies and interventions.
Absolutely. If we understand how people actually behave, we can create policies that are more effective and have a greater impact.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about trust in economists, the complexities of migration, the limits of economic growth, and the role of government. It seems like there's a common thread running through all of this.
What do you mean?
Well, it's this idea that we need to move beyond simplistic solutions and embrace a more nuanced, human-centered approach to economics. We need to recognize that people are not just cogs in a machine. They have dreams, aspirations, fears, and values that shape their economic choices.
It's about seeing economics as a tool for improving human lives, not just generating wealth.
Exactly. And that's what I find so compelling about good economics for hard times. It challenges us to think differently about the world and to consider new possibilities.
And it encourages us to be more compassionate and understanding in our approach to solving economic problems.
It's a reminder that behind all the data and statistics, there are real people whose lives are affected by these decisions.
Absolutely. So, moving on, have you ever thought about trade? It's one of those topics that always generates a lot of strong opinions.
Oh, definitely. It seems simple enough on the surface, right?
Yeah.
Two parties exchange goods or services, everyone benefits. But then you start digging deeper and it gets really complicated.
It does. One of the fundamental ideas in trade theory is this concept of specialization. Back in the 19th century, economist David Ricardo explained how countries could gain by focusing on producing things they're relatively good at and then trading with each other. You know, like England making cloth and Portugal producing wine. Both countries end up better off by specializing in trading.
Right, it makes sense in theory. But the real world is messy, isn't it?
It is. And sometimes those textbook examples don't quite capture the full picture.
Like, people often point to China and India as examples of how trade can fuel economic growth.
True.
But their experiences are actually quite different.
Right. China, after being pretty much closed off to the world for decades under communism, they embraced trade in the late 20th century and experienced this phenomenal period of growth.
They became like the world's factory, churning out all sorts of goods.
Exactly.
India, on the other hand, had this long history of protectionist policies, with lots of import restrictions and high tariffs.
It wasn't until they had this major financial crisis in 1991 that they were forced to liberalize their trade policies.
And even then, it's hard to say for sure how much of India's subsequent growth was directly due to trade liberalization.
Right. There were other factors at play, too, like domestic reforms and the overall global economic environment.
It's like this tangled web, isn't it? It's hard to isolate one variable and say, this is what caused that.
Absolutely. And the complexities of trade go far beyond just looking at aggregate economic indicators like GDP.
Like what?
Well, one of the key insights from trade theory is that while free trade can benefit a country as a whole, it can also create winners and losers within that country. Well, it has to do with the relative abundance or scarcity of different factors of production, like labor, capital, and land. In a country where capital is abundant and labor is scarce, for instance, opening up to trade might benefit the owners of capital but hurt workers.
Ah, so it's not just about whether a country as a whole gains from trade. It's also about how those gains are distributed.
Precisely. The book gives this example of the influx of Chinese goods into the U.S. market. Overall, the U.S. economy benefited from cheaper imports, but certain regions that were heavily reliant on manufacturing saw job losses and economic decline.
So even if trade makes the pie bigger, some people might end up with a smaller slice.
Exactly. And this highlights the importance of having policies in place to help those who are negatively affected by trade.
Like retraining programs for workers who lose their jobs, or investments in infrastructure to help revitalize struggling communities.
Yes, exactly. And the book also discusses this fascinating research by economist Hapia Topalova, who looked at the effects of trade liberalization on poverty in India.
And what did she find?
Well, she found that while poverty in India decreased overall during the period of trade liberalization, districts that were more exposed to trade actually experienced slower poverty reduction.
Wow, that's surprising.
It is, and it challenges this assumption that the benefits of trade will automatically trickle down to everyone.
So it's not a simple story, is it?
Not at all. And it brings us back to this idea of stickiness that we were talking about earlier.
Right, how people and resources don't always move as easily as economic models might predict.
Exactly. So, if workers in a declining industry are reluctant to move to a region with more opportunities, for example, that can hinder the growth of that region. And if companies are slow to adapt to changing market conditions, that can lead to economic decline in their area.
They're all connected.
It is. And it suggests that simplistic solutions, like just opening up to free trade without any thought for the consequences, are unlikely to achieve the desired outcomes.
So we need to be more thoughtful and nuanced in our approach to trade policy.
We do. We need to consider the distributional effects, the social impacts, and the long-term consequences.
And again, it comes back to that human element, doesn't it?
Absolutely. We can't forget that economics is ultimately about people.
Their hopes, their dreams, their struggle.
Exactly. And that's what makes it such a fascinating and important field.
So we've seen how trade, like migration, is this complex issue with all these interconnected factors at play.
And it raises all sorts of questions about how we measure progress and well-being.
Right? Is GDP really the best way to gauge a country's success?
The book argues that it's a very limited measure.
I mean, it doesn't capture things like environmental quality, leisure time, or social cohesion.
All those things that contribute to a good life but don't necessarily show up in traditional economic statistics.
Exactly. The authors call them unpriced values. Like, how do you put a price tag on spending time with loved ones, breathing clean air, or feeling safe in your community?
It's impossible, and yet these things are essential for human flourishing.
So we need to be careful not to get too fixated on GDP growth as the sole measure of progress.
We do. We need a more holistic view that takes into account a wider range of factors.
And that brings us to the question of what role technology plays in all of this.
Technology has this power to both enhance and disrupt our lives.
It can create new opportunities, but it can also lead to job displacement and inequality.
The book talks about the rise of automation and artificial intelligence and how these technologies are transforming the labor market.
There's this fear, right, that robots are going to take all our jobs.
It's a fear that's been around for centuries whenever there's a new technological breakthrough, but this time does feel different somehow.
Like the pace of change is so rapid.
Exactly. And the capabilities of these new technologies are really impressive.
The book highlights research by economists David Otter and Pasquale Restrepo, who studied the impact of automation on U.S. labor markets.
They found that while automation has displaced some jobs, it's also created new ones, particularly in fields that require creativity, problem-solving, and social intelligence.
So it's not a simple story of robots replacing humans. It's more nuanced than that.
It is, but the research also showed that automation has contributed to the widening wage gap between high-skilled and low-skilled workers.
It's creating both opportunities and challenges.
It is, and it underscores the importance of investing in education and training to ensure that everyone has the skills they need to thrive in this rapidly evolving technological landscape.
We need to make sure that people aren't left behind.
Absolutely. And we also need to think carefully about the ethical implications of artificial intelligence. As machines become more sophisticated, we have to ensure that they're used in ways that benefit humanity as a whole, not just a select few.
It's a big responsibility.
It is, and it's one that we need to take seriously.
So we've talked about trade, technology, and the challenges they present, but ultimately it all comes back to the question of what kind of society we want to create.
What values do we want to prioritize?
What role should government play in shaping the economy and ensuring that everyone has the opportunity to succeed?
These are big
They
questions.
are. And there's no easy answers.
Uh-huh.
But good economics for hard times provides a framework for thinking about these issues in a more nuanced and compassionate way.
It encourages us to challenge assumptions, embrace evidence, and put people at the center of our economic policies.
It's a reminder that economics is not just about numbers and graphs. It's about people's lives. It's about creating an economy that works for everyone, not just a privileged few.
That's a great way to put it, and that really brings us to the heart of what good economics for hard times is all about. It's this call to action, to think differently, to challenge those old assumptions, and to embrace more evidence-based approach to policymaking.
And to remember that at the end of the day, economics should be about improving human well-being, not just about maximizing profits or GDP. To really achieve that, though, we kind of have to confront some uncomfortable truths, both about ourselves and the systems we've created.
Like, what do you mean?
Well, for example, the idea that we're always rational actors when it comes to economic decisions. Behavioral economics has shown us that that's just not true.
Oh, definitely not. Our emotions, our biases, our social norms, they all play a huge role in shaping our choices, even our economic choices.
And those choices aren't always in our best interest or the best interest of society as a whole.
Right, we make mistakes, we get swayed by marketing, we succumb to peer pressure.
And that's where I think good policy comes in.
Mm.
It's not about trying to force people to behave in a certain way. It's about understanding those behavioral quirks and designing interventions that nudge people in the right direction.
Like, I remember that study about organ donation rates. In some countries, people have to opt in to be organ donors, and the participation rates are pretty low. But in other countries where people have to opt out, the participation rates are much higher.
It's crazy how such a small change can have such a big impact.
Exactly. And it shows how we can use behavioral insights to achieve better outcomes without having to resort to, heavy-handed regulations or mandates.
But nudges alone aren't going to solve all our problems, are they? I mean, there's this deep-seated mistrust of government that we need to address.
Oh, absolutely. A lot of people see government as inefficient, wasteful, even corrupt.
And sometimes those perceptions are justified, sadly.
True. But the authors make a really important point. They say that we need a more nuanced perspective on government intervention.
So it's not about being pro-government or anti-government, it's about being pro-solutions.
Exactly. Recognizing that government has an important role to play in addressing certain challenges like climate change or inequality, but also acknowledging that government programs need to be designed and implemented effectively with accountability and transparency.
And that's where trust comes in, right? If people don't trust the government to spend their tax dollars wisely or to act in their best interest, they're going to be resistant to any kind of intervention, no matter how well-intentioned.
It's this vicious cycle, isn't it?
It is. And breaking that cycle requires, I think, a fundamental shift in how we view the relationship between citizens and the state.
A new social contract, perhaps?
Yeah, exactly. One that's based on mutual respect, transparency, and a shared commitment to building a better future. The old contract, the one where economic growth was supposed to lift all boats, it's clearly not working anymore.
Nope.
You've got soaring inequality, stagnant wages for many, and a growing sense of disillusionment among those who feel left behind.
A lot of people are struggling.
And to address that, I think, we need a social contract that prioritizes shared prosperity, not just growth for the sake of growth.
So things like strengthening the social safety net, investing in education and job training, making sure that everyone has access to affordable health care.
Exactly. And also addressing those systemic barriers that perpetuate inequality and limit social mobility. It's about creating a society where everyone has a fair shot at a good life.
It's a big challenge for sure, but it's one that we have to tackle.
And that, I think, is the ultimate message of good economics for hard times. It's a reminder that we have the power to shape a better world, but it's going to require us to be bold, to think differently, and to act collectively.
And to never lose sight of that human element.
Absolutely. So to our listeners, we encourage you to pick up a copy of Good Economics for Hard Times and dive into these important conversations. Share what you learned with your friends, family, colleagues. Let's work together to create an economy that works for everyone, not just a privileged few.
And remember, the future is not predetermined. We have the power to shape it.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep striving for a better world.